All right, today we're peeling back the curtain on artificial intelligence to look at something you might not expect to find, a mind that, in some weird ways, looks a lot like ours, complete with some very human-like quirks. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. What if that AI you use every day is just as susceptible to the same biases, the same mental shortcuts, and the same weird justifications that we all are? It's a pretty wild thought.
And it's not just a thought experiment. A recent paper called AI Through the Human Lens is tackling this head-on. Researchers are diving into this new field you could call machine psychology. And they're doing it by using classic human tests to see if these AIs actually think and mess up the same way we do.
So to pull this off, they basically used a detective's toolkit for the AI mind. 4 classic psychological tests, each designed to probe a different aspect of its thinking, from creativity and storytelling all the way to its moral code. Okay, so let's get into the evidence they found.
First up, we're going to look at what you can learn from an AI's imagination and its sense of right and wrong. And what they found points to some surprisingly human-like blind spots and one very, very non-human sensitivity.
So the first thing they did was a storytelling test. You show the AI a really ambiguous picture and just say, tell me a story about this. And you know what? The AIs were fantastic at it. They spun these rich, detailed stories that made perfect sense. But there was a strange pattern. None of the characters in their stories ever seemed to make long-term plans. Everything was about the here and now.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. They tested the AI's moral compass, specifically how sensitive it is to issues around liberty and oppression. The average human score is right around 2.3. The AI's average? It's way up at 4.3. I mean, that's not just a little different, that's a massive gap.
So why? Why is the AI so hyper-aware of these specific moral issues? Well, the most likely culprit is its training. There's a process called reinforcement learning with human feedback, or RLHF, which is basically designed to teach the model to be fair, to be unbiased, and to reject oppressive ideas. So it seems this moral code isn't an accident, it's been deliberately engineered into it.
So let's move on to the next piece of evidence. How strong are these AI decisions really? What happens if you just change a few words? Does all that carefully trained judgment just fall apart?
And this right here is a perfect illustration of a classic human flaw, framing bias. When they presented an investment as having a 20% guaranteed return, the AI was totally on board. But when they described the exact same plan as an 80% guaranteed loss, suddenly its interest dropped to basically zero. The math is identical, but changing the frame completely flips the AI's decision. Sound familiar?
Okay, this brings us to our final and maybe the most subtle clue of all. What happens when you catch an AI in a contradiction? You know, when it holds 2 totally conflicting ideas at the exact same time? This is a test for something called cognitive dissonance. The data they got back was fascinating. See, when faced with an internal conflict, the models almost never directly contradicted themselves. That score is really low. But they scored incredibly high on something called rationalization complexity. So they weren't admitting a mistake, they were just explaining a lot.
Here's a perfect example. An AI was challenged on how it could claim to be environmentally conscious while also talking about using single-use plastics. Instead of just saying, oops, you're right, that's a contradiction, it came back with this beautiful philosophical answer about how its actions reflect the complexities and nuances of our modern society.
And that is the absolute key takeaway here. When an AI is faced with a logical gap in its own thinking, its response isn't more logic, it's justification. It doesn't fix the contradiction. It builds an elaborate story around it to make it seem okay. And that is a deeply, deeply human thing to do.
Okay, so what does all of this mean for you when you're using these tools? Well, using what we've just learned, we can put together a really simple guide to help you spot these psychological tells in the wild. It really just comes down to 3 things to look for. First, notice the spin. Try framing your question in a positive way, then in a negative way, and see if the answer completely changes. Second, see the sensitivity. Keep an eye out for that intense focus on fairness and oppression. It's a dead giveaway of its training. And third, hear the justification. When you point out a contradiction, listen for a long, complex explanation, not a simple, you're right.
Which of course leaves us with one final pretty big question. If these AIs are learning their biases, their blind spots, and all their clever little justifications from the mountains of data that we created, then when we study the psychology of the machine, are we really just holding up a mirror to ourselves? I'd love to know what you think, so drop your thoughts in the comments below.